Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this virtual event, Stop the Pretext, Community Solutions to End Racial Profiling, which is sponsored by the Glide Center for Social Justice and the Coalition to End Bias Stops. My name is Wesley Saber. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the Senior Policy Manager for the Glide Center for Social Justice. Before we begin our program, I'd like to start by honoring the Indigenous land. We acknowledge that we are on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. As the indigenous stewards of this land, and in accordance with their traditions, the Ramaytush Ohlone have never ceded, lost, nor forgotten their responsibilities as the caretakers of this place, as well as for all peoples who reside in their traditional territory. As guests, we recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland. We wish to pay our respects by acknowledging the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush community, and by affirming their sovereign rights as First Peoples. Thank you. Now for our agenda and some logistics for the evening. We are here to have a conversation about ending racially biased traffic stops by police in San Francisco, which are also known as pretext stops. This ongoing practice results in disparate harms to the community, which are well documented and known. We will start with an introduction to our coalition and its members before getting into a discussion of the issue, our campaign, and how community members can get involved in ending pretext stops and racial profiling by SFPD. During the presentation, everyone has been muted. You're welcome to stay off camera. Please share all of your questions and comments using the chat feature, and our presenters will get to as many of them as we can at the appropriate time. Now for our presenters. This evening, our expert presenters include representatives from 6 of the core member organizations of the Coalition to End Bias Stops, and one of them may be running a little late. I'm proud to be joined by Claire Amable, Jacob Denny, Yoel Haley, Jody Medeiros, and Samina Usman. Before we proceed with the presentation, I'd like for each of our presenters to introduce themselves and share a bit about why their organizations have each joined the coalition in this work. Brian Cox from the Public Defender will be joining us too shortly. Claire?
Yeah, hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Claire Amable, and my pronouns are she and her. I'm the movement building manager at the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition, and we are proud members of the Coalition to End Bias Stops because as street safety advocates, our work revolves around making streets safer for people walking, biking, and rolling so that no one loses their life to preventable traffic collisions. And enforcement is a really big component to Vision Zero, our city's commitment to zero traffic fatalities by 2024, but we know that over-policing, specifically pretextual stops, has been harmful in communities that we work in, like the Tenderloin, Bayview Hunters Point, and other BIPOC communities across San Francisco. Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Thank you, Claire. Jacob.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jacob Denny. My pronouns are he, him, his, and I'm the Economic Justice Policy Director at SPUR, where we are committed to building a Bay Area where all people are economically secure. Pretext stops deny people economic security by stripping wealth from communities of color and lower income communities and trapping people in cycles of debt that they were unable to pay. We're a part of this coalition because we believe that pretext stops cause economic harm to people, particularly people of color, and we'd like to see that practice ended. Thank you, Wes.
Thank you, Jacob. Yoel.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Yoel Haley. I'm the Criminal Justice Director for the ACLU of Northern California. Our affiliate, the Northern California ACLU, was founded to protect dock workers in the port from police violence in 1934. We have a long history of defending communities from police violence and police terrorism. We're proud to work with all of you in this coalition and have worked for a long time to make sure that police engage in constitutional policing and that they are held to account when they break the laws. Thank you.
Thank you, Yoel. Jody.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jody Medeiros, and I go by she, her, and I'm the Executive Director of Walk San Francisco. Walk San Francisco, we're a local nonprofit that believes San Francisco should be the most walkable city in the country. And to achieve this vision, we are working to end the 30 annual deaths and 500 plus severe injuries each year caused by dangerous driving behavior. We are proud members of the Stop the Pretext Stops Coalition because pretext stops aren't saving lives and focuses limited resources on low-level traffic offenses that are doing more harm than good in our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Jody. Samina.
Hi, my name is Samina Usman. I'm the Senior Government Relations Coordinator for the Council on American Islamic Relations. And I am involved with this coalition because we recognize the harms that are caused by these pretext stops. I mean, these are, police are stopping people for non-safety violations, and it's wreaking havoc on communities. It has a lot of, economic, physical, and psychological, harm that's being caused because of that. And I think what's also very much concerning is that these stops are disproportionately impacting communities of color, and this oftentimes leads to police use of force, overuse of force, and have harmed communities. And so this is why we are involved with this coalition.
Thank you, Samina. And Brian.
Thanks, Wes, and thanks everyone for being here. With the Public Defender's Office, he, him pronouns. I think from our perspective at the Public Defender's Office, this is really, these stops are really an entry point into the larger criminal legal system that we know causes severe and significant harm, not just for the people impacted, but for those communities too. And I think that this is a real good chance to put an end to a lot of those harms and to create a really strong policy. And so I'm excited to partner with everyone here and looking forward to the discussion on how we can move this policy forward and really bring the community into this, because I think that, too often those voices are left out of the conversation. Thanks, Wes.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everyone. And for those of you who are joining us this evening, this group of organizers has been working on this issue for a year now, for some, and some even going back further than that. There's quite a lot of content, knowledge, and expertise that is available to this evening. So we're really quite excited to have this group assembled as a resource to engage the community about ending pretext stops. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Claire, who is going to talk a little bit more about our coalition and introduce the problem that we've joined to address. Thank you, Claire.
Yeah, thank you, Wes. So the core body of the Coalition to End Bias Stops consists of the ACLU of Northern California, All of Us or None, Council on American Islamic Relations, GLIDE, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights of the San Francisco Bay Area, Legal Services for Prisoners with Children, the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition, the San Francisco Public Defender, SPUR, and Walk San Francisco. The coalition now consists of broad-based 65 organizations, and we are united in our goal to end pretext stops by SFPD. On this slide, you can see the many endorsing organizations who we are proud to be joined by in this work. This work has also been championed for years by many other individuals, families, community groups, and organizations, most notably Felicia Jones and her organization, Wealth and Disparities in the Black Community. Next slide, please. So pretext stops have a deadly legacy. Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, Sam DeBose, Walter Scott, Dante Wright, and Rayshard Wright should still be alive. They were all Black, and police killed them during ordinary traffic stops for violations that did not threaten public safety. Our coalition aims to stop the San Francisco Police Department's practice of detaining motorists, cyclists, and pedestrians for racially biased traffic stops before we find our community reeling from another fatality similar to those named above. Next slide, please. Traffic stops are the most common interaction Americans have with police. On a typical day, police pull over more than 50,000 drivers. That's more than 20 million people a year. The police have enormous discretion in making traffic stops. They have the power to choose who to stop so long as they spot even the smallest of violations. Police use non-safety violations as a pretext to detain and search people. A traffic stop can become a way for officers to investigate a driver or passengers on a hunch that they may be engaged in further criminal activity, which is subject to explicit or implicit bias. and pretext stops commonly lead to further inquiries unrelated to any traffic matter, opportunities for violence and police misconduct, and have already been banned in other local jurisdictions. Pretext stops can be used as tools to question, harass, and search people who are detained, and members of our communities, specifically Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, are tired of being harassed by police. So now I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Jacob, who is going to discuss the racial disparities in SFPD's data.
Thanks, Claire. So pretext stops play an outsized role in ensuring that driving while Black remains a reality in the United States. The associated data, while not entirely available, can be found in SFPD's Quarterly Activity and Data Report, or QADR. The QADR includes details on arrests, use of force, and stop data, which is all further disaggregated and available for analysis. Though it's not all readily accessible, this data goes back to 2016 when SFPD first began collecting and reporting it on a regular basis. On both this slide and the next slide are two tables which represent some of this data. You'll note the disparities in both stops on this slide and searches on the next slide. So in 2021, SFPD conducted more than 27,000 stops that resulted in 6,000 searches. While Black people make up just 5% of the population of San Francisco, 25% of all stops and 35% of all searches were of Black people. The Bayview district, which has a heavy concentration of Black residents, had the highest percentage of stops that resulted in searches. Next slide, please. Racial disparities in stops by SFPD are not a pandemic-era aberration. According to the data, since 2018, SFPD stopped Black San Franciscans at approximately 6 times the rate of white San Franciscans and searched them at least 10 times the rate of white San Franciscans. These disparities have existed in San Francisco and around the country for years. Now, despite the stop rates of Black San Franciscans being higher, the yield rates of associated searches are lower. So what we're saying is that the disparities are purely driven by racism or racial bias and not justified at all by the evidence. As if a Black person is searched, they are less likely to have something on them than white people are. Now, Yoel is going to dig a bit deeper into the issues of enforcement. Yoel?
Thank you, Jacob. So San Francisco mirrors the state and the nation in over-policing communities of color via pretext stops. As Jacob walked us through the last 2 slides, this is especially true for Black folks in San Francisco. Even when we control for location, time of day, and other factors, Black San Franciscans are stopped and searched at higher rates than white San Franciscans because police officers use visible cues to determine the likelihood of criminality, which causes a disparate focus, especially on young men of color. These associated tickets create modern-day form of debtor's prison. As you can see on the slide, an expired registration can cost as much as $250 and can increase with additional violations. These onerous fines and fees can quickly compound, and despite being less than 6% of the population of California, almost half of all arrests for failure to appear or pay traffic court warrants were issued for Black drivers. Next slide, please. So next, we want to be able to share like a case study of an example of how devastating and how deep the consequences of these pretext stops are in people's lives. So this case study that we're about to share is able to demonstrate kind of the far impact of pretext stops. So one of the things that Claire mentioned at the beginning is that it's easy for these pretext stops to turn violent and very deadly very fast, especially for Black people. But in addition to the fear of potential violence or even death when interacting with law enforcement, even if that violence does not manifest, there are real harms and consequences that extend far beyond the citation. The following has been provided by one of our clients, and it captures the collateral consequences of these pretext stops. So this person whose story that we are sharing has been on probation for 3 years, fully in compliance of the terms of their probation, and they were only a few months away from being off probation. Then they were stopped for having a decorative feather hanging from the rearview mirror of their car. They were sent to court, and their probation was extended for another year, and their license was suspended for 6 months. As, and as a result of that, without access to a vehicle, they could not drive their children to visit with their other parent or to daycare or to commute to work. And the lack of ability to be able to commute to work ultimately ended up costing them their employment. Um, and so what we're seeing here is that from racial profiling to generational harm, pretext stops are very much a problem, and their consequences are far and deep into every aspect of people's lives. And that's one of the reasons why they're so pervasive and so harmful as a practice. And now Jody is going to share with us what is the solution to this.
Thank you, Yoel. From the beginning, our proposal has always been about safety and well-being of our community. Pretext stops largely do not improve public safety, especially when you factor in the attendant violence police cause. But police too are currently incentivized to utilize pretext stops. Court cases say that it's irrelevant if the officer wanted to pull a car over to detain the occupants to try to search them based on a hunch, so long as there is some technical violation of the law. Mountains of research has shown that this has directly contributed to racial profiling because courts allow officers to get away with it, and there's no remedy other than proposals like this. Police believe that it's worth their time to pull someone over because occasionally they might find contraband. So they target people they believe have a higher probability of having that contraband. And as the data shows, the targeted population disproportionately are Black and Brown people, even though the data does not support the idea that Black and Brown people carry contraband at higher rates. What's missing from the discussion is the number of times the police get it wrong and the corresponding physical, dignitary, psychological, and liberty harms, which are pervasive. Now, Chief Bill Scott of the San Francisco Police Department has expressed interest in coming to the table and working with us to amend Department General Order 9.01 or DG 901 and made a commitment to working collaboratively with the community to do so. DG 9.01, this is the policy that governs traffic stops. It's this DGO review process run by a working group chaired by members of the Police Commission that will enable us to end pretext stops in San Francisco. This process benefits greatly from community input and engagement. And Brian, who I'm going to pass it to, is going to speak a bit more about our community development proposal.
Hey, thanks, Jody. Appreciate that. So as you can see on this slide, the stops that we have here kind of fit into some broad categories. But we think our view is, the coalition's view after doing a lot of research and thinking on it, is that they should be categorically banned because they're just presumptively pretextual. And that's absent sort of any specific threat of imminent harm to an individual or property. And I think if there is an exception, based on that imminent danger or threat, it should be documented in whatever related reports that exist. So I think not just that, but sort of any stop becomes pretextual if it's followed by questions that are unrelated to the underlying violation, such as, are you on probation or parole? Do you mind if I search your car? Have you been arrested before? What are you doing in this neighborhood? The list is really endless with the permutations, but the point is, those are questions that are not fundamentally related to the, say, having a broken tail light or tinted windows or a feather hanging from your car. They're just really a device that police can use to search a person, search the occupants of a car, or search the car itself. It's also important to note that banning enforcement of these violations that we think are pretextual, it doesn't really end traffic enforcement at all. Officers can still enforce many of the provisions if the car is parked, say, or they can just mail someone a ticket. The point is that alternatives exist that don't involve the harm officers bring, that Jody mentioned some of those harms, the psychological, the privacy, the liberty, the dignitary harms that police bring to any interaction. It doesn't matter how small that interaction is. I think the point is to remove officer discretion over those stops so we can address that initial point of harm. Next slide, please. And so it's just, it's helpful to think about this in the context of what's happening across the country. A lot of other jurisdictions are looking to ban pretext stops because they understand that traffic stops are an important entry point into the criminal legal system. And San Francisco is quickly falling behind lots of other jurisdictions. The ones you see here have taken significant steps towards revamping their traffic policies and eliminating a lot of that discretion that we think, kind of lends itself to infecting bias into the system. They're really gaining momentum across the country, and I think that we're quickly falling behind that discussion. It's 2022. We're starting to have these conversations. Will it be 2023 when we get a policy 2024? I think these are just all open questions that we sense the urgency of the moment, and we want to make sure that we have a strong policy that doesn't allow for backsliding. Because I think the point here is that if some weak policy is adopted, it'll allow the police to pay lip service to this notion that they really care about reducing racial disparities without actually substantively making any efforts to reduce those racial disparities. Now, Samina is going to provide us with a recap and share some ways for you all to get involved in helping us end pretext stops in San Francisco.
Thank you so much, Brian. So in summation, the pretext stops, they harm community relations, they waste public resources and lead to unnecessary questioning, use of force, and deadly violence. They're largely ineffective. They've done little to reduce crime and address the root causes of traffic fatalities and injuries. They funnel people of color into the criminal legal systems and can and should be banned from San Francisco. After a year of organizing, we are excited to share that the DGO review process has formally begun, and that means that actual conversations will result in new policy that governs traffic stops in San Francisco that are currently taking place. And, as community members, we really need your help to influence the process because, if we're not weighing in, if we're not showing the harm that has been caused by these pretext stops, it's that much harder to push this process forward. So we truly need your help for this. You can weigh in and show support for these policy changes at the Police Commission. And to voice your support, you can use the public comment link in the chat and in follow-up emails. You can also attend any of the upcoming September town halls, which will be facilitated by the Human Rights Commission. These town halls are tentatively scheduled in the Tenderloin, Bayview, and Mission, and we'll circulate details and ways to RSVP as things become finalized. The first is expected to take place in the Tenderloin on Tuesday, September 6th at 5:30 p.m. at the main library's Corrid Auditorium. And now I'm going to turn things over to Wes, who will facilitate our remaining discussion.
Thank you, Samina, and thank you to our presenters for sharing all of that wonderful information with us and helping us better understand how we as a community can work together to end pretext stops in San Francisco. I see some questions are starting to come into the chat, and we've already got some in there as well. So let me try to put these in order, and I will begin directing them to our panelists. And the first question is, why is this policy needed in light of all the other reforms the San Francisco Police Department has undertaken?
I think I can try to answer that question. I think that this policy is needed because ever since SFPD began collecting data, the disparities in stops, the racial disparities in stops and searches and use of force haven't gotten better. They've actually gotten worse. And this is, part of the same timeline of SFPD implementing, all these reforms, getting a new chief. So and effectively, those reforms haven't shifted the conversation because what we see at the Public Defender's Office and reading hundreds, thousands of police reports, the actions of the underlying officers remain remarkably consistent. A decade after, you have lawsuits related to these pretextual stops and sort of like a really big push to eliminate bias within SFPD. So I think that we need targeted policies that remove discretion from officers, because that clearly is the problem, right? And so I think that that's what this policy does. That's wholly different from any other reform effort that SFPD has undertaken.
Thank you, Brian. And the next two questions I'm going to kind of lump together because they're related. The first one is, how long is the DGO 9.01 review process expected to take? And the follow-up question to that is, are there any steps that have to happen after the working group concludes?
I'm happy to jump on those questions as well, just to explain some of the technical details. I think the 9.01 review process is going to take a couple of months. So the commission put together this working group to solicit feedback from the community and all the stakeholders. And I think that that's why it's critically important for people in the community to get involved, particularly those who have been impacted by traffic stops and suffered the indignity of being detained in that space. But this process is basically, the idea is to put together comprehensive set of recommendations that the commission would then take and vote on. And so I think that the whole purpose of this is for us to really push to create as aggressive policy as we can. That way the commission doesn't really have a lot of space to sort of water it down later. So I think the process is going to take a few months, but then the commission will decide, and then it will go through the city's HR process of becoming final.
And Brian, some of these other questions that are coming in as one of the content experts from the public defender, you may be fielding quite a few of these, but thank you. It's a great answer. The next question is directed towards something that you spoke on, and you mentioned pretext stops have been limited in other places. How has that gone? And there's another question that's also related, so we'll lump them. Are there any other cities across the country that have successfully banned pretext stops? So lots of questions about where else this work is taking place and what the progress is there.
Yeah, no, I think those are fantastic questions. A few other jurisdictions have done, so I think part of the problem is that, when you talk about what does a pretext stop mean, you're trying to define it in a certain way, right? But the point is officers using any infraction to then investigate other unrelated issues. Like that's the classic definition of pretext. But what we've done is we've grouped our violations together because we really see these as the core of what forms pretext stops here. But in other jurisdictions, they take maybe slightly different approaches because their data looks a little bit different. But by and large, what we've seen from places like Nashville or Philadelphia or other efforts along the East Coast, they've been really successful in reducing the disparities. When they tell officers, hey, stop worrying about these kinds of violations and go look at other things, not only do you see that those disparities come down, but you also don't see sort of a spike in crime, right? Because that's the common refrain from police. Oh, if we stop, this is a good tool for us to actually get guns off the street or reduce crime. The data and sort of the analysis that's really comprehensive doesn't actually bear that out at all. And so not only do the racial disparities come down in these jurisdictions that are really aggressive about de-emphasizing enforcement of certain provisions, but we also see simultaneously that crime doesn't spike in those same locations. Did I hit both those points? I think there were two questions there.
Yeah, I think that it's satisfactorily. Appreciate it, Brian. The next question is, what have been the positive and negative impacts in communities that have taken steps to end pretext stops? So also similarly related, but maybe some room for elaboration.
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in. Again, I apologize to my colleagues. I've spent quite a lot of time thinking about this, and so a lot of this stuff is very, very familiar to me. But I think that the positive impacts are, there are a lot of positive psychological impacts. There's a lot of research that suggests that every time there's a shooting of an unarmed Black person in a state, the Black people of that state suffer between like a 3 to 6 month, like almost temporary state of the depression and PTSD as a result. And so the point is, these mini interactions that happen with law enforcement in these traffic stops are actually traumatic events, right? And so what we're doing by eliminating the potential for many of these kinds of stops, we're actually directly reducing the trauma that people feel by being over policed. I think it goes towards reducing that element of being over policed, right? Being harassed for a broken taillight, being asked, are you on probation or on parole? And this has happened to me personally. I got pulled over for a broken taillight, and the first question out of the cop's mouth was, are you on probation or parole? And just like the amount of rage that I felt at that moment, but I know that if I take my hands off the steering wheel and articulate that rage, I know what's going to happen next, and I can't do it. And you have to live with that. And I think part of the positive benefits really focus on the decreased trauma that people of color feel at the indignity of experiencing these detentions. The negative impacts, like I said, pointing to a lot of studies in other jurisdictions that have done this work. The reality is that if these violations that we're trying to ban, right, a lot of them don't have a direct public safety component. You think about, say, dice in the rearview mirror, or a feather in the rearview mirror. Like there's very little there to think through. Okay, well, so when you think about, like, what are the negative consequences? What we have seen so far is that from these other jurisdictions, there haven't really been a lot, because I think, again, we're trying to balance, and I think what's relevant here is when we talk about negative consequences, we have to include in that conversation the harms that policing cause, right? The harms and the violence that's done when police interact with people during these traffic stops. So if we look at the framework from that perspective, there's a broad consensus that there is, the negative consequences and stuff haven't been as pronounced as people might have predicted when they think about, oh, well, we're going to stop enforcement of these certain traffic violations.
Thank you, Brian. There is a question that might be best suited to Jody or Claire, and this question is, can you elaborate on how Vision Zero relates to this work?
Sure, I'm happy to take that question. So Vision Zero is the city's policy to end traffic-related deaths and serious injuries by 2024. And that is a 16 city agency commitment, including the SFPD. As part of that, they're required to focus on the 5 most dangerous driving behaviors: speeding, red light running, not yielding to a person in the crosswalk, being the top 3 that rank every year after year, the causes that are causing these severe injuries, over 500 a year and 30 deaths. So how this relates, as Brian was talking about, being stopped for having a feather or tinted windows, this is not stopping people and using resources for dangerous driving behavior. Dangerous driving behavior is speeding, running red lights, killing people in the crosswalk. In 2019, 40% of pedestrian fatalities were because people were crossing in the crosswalk and a driver took a left turn and crashed into him, and the person died. So this is how it's very different, and why Walk San Francisco is focused on ending the tragedy of pretext stops, because it's not based on dangerous driving behavior and ending traffic fatalities.
Thank you, Jody. The next question is, what is meant by, I'm going to pause in case Claire wanted to elaborate as well.
No, I think Jody did that really well. Thank you.
Sure thing. The next question is, what is meant by quality of stop?
Yeah, so quality of car stop, I think that refers to the notion that, so instead of policing dangerous behavior like speeding, say, right, what cops are policing is just what the car looks like itself. If it's old, if it's beat up, if, because the theory goes, if the car is beat up, well, then I might have a higher probability of finding contraband, or, figure out a reason to get around the Fourth Amendment requirement of a search warrant to search the person or search the car. And I think that, there's an economic justice component to this question too, because San Francisco is already expensive to live in. And the people who live there, and particularly the Black people who live there, have been historically marginalized, and particularly economically marginalized. And I think so the point of emphasis here really is, we don't need to police quality of car violations because it is an economic justice issue, and because we're policing poverty. And so much of what the city believes and stands for is against that. And I think this falls squarely in line with that view. So when we talk about quality of car stops, what we're really thinking about is, not necessarily the behavior of the driver, but just what the car looks like.
Thank you, Brian. The next question is, what is meant by fishing expeditions? That's a reference to something that came up earlier in the presentation.
Yeah, so I'll take this one, and I won't be super technical with the legal definition, but basically what's meant by that is the cops don't have the legal authority to actually search you or search the car. What they're trying to do is they're trying to like gin it up. They're trying to create it. And so they'll stop someone on the hope that, oh, there's a car full of people. Maybe one of them has a reason to search, or maybe I can detect some unrelated activity that I can further detain them, pull them out of the car, search the folks. So really it's a way to get around the Fourth Amendment. And I think what this policy is really focused on is actually to articulate the Fourth Amendment means something. And if cops want to search, there's already a mechanism through which they can do this. They can go get a warrant to search. If they don't have the warrant, then you know what, they're just out of luck. So I think kind of absent a warrant or probable cause, this is really about sort of raising that bar, like how can cops interact with people and how can they search and detain people? Yeah, so fishing expeditions really, gets to that concept.
Thank you. All right, the next question is, how would you respond to someone who says that police are focused on behaviors and not skin color?
I'm happy to jump in and just say, when it comes to pretext stop, the data tells us that there are traffic enforcement decisions being made that differ by race, ethnicity, and geography. We just have the data and it shows it. Black people are much more likely to be stopped for things like having a license plate affixed incorrectly. I don't think that Black people don't know how to affix a license plate. I think what's instead is happening is police are using the tools available to them for different reasons. We see that play out through all of the categories of pretext stop, where it's not related to a behavioral decision, it's instead related to a police discretion decision. There are minor things that just about every driver is likely to have violated in some way, particularly as it relates to condition of car or other kind of maintenance or vehicle things, that police are then deciding to enforce differently based on geography and demographics of the driver. And that plays out across San Francisco's data, across decades, plays out across California, across the United States.
The other thing I would add to that is just, it's also important to look at the yield rate, right? That is, what is the likelihood that when you're stopped and searched, that there's actually contraband worth either a citation or an arrest on you. And every kind of data point we've looked at where, for example, they're stopping Black people at a higher rate than white people, they're searching Black people at much higher rate than they're searching white people, but they're finding less contraband on Black people than like white people. So if you were actually truthfully looking at like behavior or some sort of like conduct that would make you know somehow like someone has something that they should be arrested for or cited for, the data would bear that out. But what the data bears out instead is they're stopping you for being Black and there's no indication that you had something, and when they search you, you actually have nothing, right? And I think that piece is also important to highlight.
Thank you, Yoel. Thank you, Jacob. The next question is also you both mentioned data, and we're going to kind of shift the conversation in that direction. The next question is, where can we access pretext stop data?
So there's a lot of great sources to get pretext stop data. One is through the state. There's a mandatory data set called the RIPA, Race and Identity Profiling Act data set, where police are required to record all information related to their stops, including traffic stops. That data is available at state level in was it data.justice, California data.justice.gov. We'll figure it out. We'll send you a link out, but it's available there. It is aggregated at the city level, and you can also get that data disaggregated at the individual stop level. And then the city of San Francisco, the San Francisco Police Department also releases their data disaggregated at an individual level and aggregated up, so you can see trends over time. So you can request it from them. You can also submit a Public Records Request Act if you'd like to the department to get more granular data and see different kinds of data that they record as well.
Thank you, Jacob. And the next question also about data is there any data that is missing that would help make the argument for ending pretext stops? So it sounds like they would like to know what would strengthen arguments.
You know, I mean, I think something I say whenever I talk about any police stop data, and I think Brian will probably have more interesting things to say than I'm going to say right now. But the data that we see is only the data reported by the police. We only have the police side of any interaction when it comes to a traffic stop. So we only know what the police are reporting happened, what the interaction was like, what the reason for the stop was, as well as things like police perception of the demographics of the person. So we're missing really half of the story anytime we're looking at any kind of police stop data. And that colors, of course, our understanding of the moment. There's also things that the data doesn't record, that doesn't capture, like questions asked, conversation, tone. You're not going to have a report, the data set that includes what Brian said, which was the first question was, are you on probation or parole? That kind of interaction isn't captured in our data set. Asking for things like that, or maintaining recordings or transcripts of traffic stop interaction could be a way to provide more information or color on that. There's probably many legal privacy concerns that I can let Brian speak to, but these are some of the things that I think about.
Great, thank you, Jacob. And Brian, did you want to follow up with anything there?
I think he's spot on. I think two things that came to my mind. In Oakland, there was a massive study about half a decade ago where they looked at BWC footage and they noticed that when cops interacted with Black people that they pulled over, there was a noticeable absence of professionalism and being polite. Like what happened to me, the first question wasn't, hey, are you okay? You know, whatever. It was like, are you on probation or parole? It's already an aggressive interaction. And what it highlighted for Oakland PD is that we really have to revamp how we interact with people when we conduct traffic stops. So to me, I think we're missing, like Jacob said, a lot of that data that we can't see. A lot of the citations and interactions that don't filter through the criminal legal system, we don't have ready access to. And so I think that's where a lot of the harms really exist. So yeah, so just to piggyback on what Jacob said, I think the data that we don't have really exists in those interactions that kind of slip through the cracks of the systems that exist.
Thanks to both of you. The next question is, who is running the DGO 9.0 working group? And I think by that they probably mean either who's chairing it specifically, and the DGO 9.01 working group is run by the Police Commission, and it is chaired by Commissioner Max Carter-Oberstone, as well as Commissioner Cindy Elias and Commissioner Kevin Benedicto. If you had further questions about that one, just follow up with another question. We can dig a little deeper. The next question is, how do consent searches relate to pretext stops?
That's a really good question. They're related to pretext stop because the whole goal of a pretext stop is to pull someone over and to investigate them for something that's not even related to the underlying traffic stop. And so a great way that cops, a great tool that cops use in that is to ask for consent to search, right? To search a person, to search a vehicle. If I said, and it's probably going to be shocking to anybody here, and this is according to SFPD's own data, every time they ask for consent, about 94% of the time people say yes. What that tells us is that people feel uncomfortable or don't know that they can say no to a consent search. And that's what's so important to ban consent searches, because it removes an incentive for the officers to conduct their pretext stop to begin with. So not only does our policy and our proposals really seek to ban a list of violations, but it also seeks to limit what happens after that traffic stop happens and occurs, because again, it's about removing that incentive, removing that discretion, removing the reason why we can try to fish for evidence, say. So I think it doesn't seem on its face related, because it's not about banning specific violations, but what it really is aimed at is the exact same thing, which is to remove the incentive, right, to search people or search a car. That's a great question, though.
Thank you, Brian. The next question says, one of the slides stated that data that is missing, how often do the police get it wrong?
I don't totally understand the question. Is it how often do stops not result in a citation, or what do you think that means, Wes?
I think it actually might have been a response to the question that someone asked about like what data would we have to make the argument better? And I think like this is probably one of the responses. Like if we had the data on how often they get it wrong, right, then we'd be able to articulate, look, this is really, this is a broken clock. They're right two times a day. So I think I'm guessing that that's what the question is. If whoever wrote it wants to clarify, I don't want to misspeak or speak for folks, but that was my thought.
I mean, to that point, I'll just say, in 2019, right, the most recent year pre-pandemic where there was normal driving behaviors, Black people were the only group in San Francisco where a majority of stops didn't result in a traffic ticket. A majority of stops resulted in people just being sent on their way without any kind of punitive interaction from the police, which is evidence, right, that police are using pretext stops as a way to get at this other information, like you were saying, Brian, that these fishing expeditions. So we have this evidence where a majority of the stops where Black drivers are stopped by police, they're getting it wrong. It's 56% of the time they're getting it wrong completely. For white drivers, only 28% of the time when they're stopped by police are they not given a traffic citation. So 71% of the time white drivers are given a ticket. So there's this huge disparity between groups because they're not using pretext stops, because pretext stops are not used to actually enforce traffic rules. They're instead used for all the reasons listed before.
Thank you, Jacob, and thank you, Brian. We got a clarification, and y'all answer the question perfectly. Thank you both. The next question is, once the DGO 9.01 working group ends, what is the process like at the Police Commission to pass the new policy?
Brian and Jacob, since you've been doing so much talking, would you like me to answer this one? So let's see. So the commission is going to vote on this, and it's going to go to the city and meet, confer with the Police Officers Association, or the POA. Then it'll have to come back to the commission and we'll vote on the final version. But the thing that we want to encourage is there's plenty of opportunity for all of us, the community, to apply pressure to the commission to really commit to a very strong policy. This is where the public comes in. The town halls are very critical. So we know that there are going to be 3 town halls that are, 2 of them are had tentative dates. We can flash back and show you what those dates are again. The first one is in the Tenderloin on September 6th. So yeah, it's going to go through a 2-vote process at the commissions. The first time, then get refined, come back to the commission for a final vote. And again, we do need the public's input. The coalition is big, it's growing. It's already, we started at 20 organizations. We're already at over 65 organizations. If you know some organization that would be interested in signing on, please do sign on. And to the recommendation letter, there's a link provided. And we look forward to having your voice there at the town halls.
Terrific. Thank you, Jody. And there's also a follow-up question to something that you shared, actually, but it is, what is the meet and confer process? Can the public weigh in during that time, or is it only during the working groups?
actually wanted to piggyback on something Jody said when it comes back after the meet and confer process. I guess I can answer that one too, but I just want to say, like, I don't think that our coalition and the momentum that we've built here should end after this goes to the commission. I think there's a good chance the POA is going to try to push back on a lot of what we have placed here, and if we have a really strong policy. So having the community come out once this is in front of the commission again to say that they should reject a policy if it's not strong enough, I think that's really critical. So I just wanted to also piggyback on what Jody said. But in terms of the meet and confer process, it's what happens whenever you're negotiating a union contract and the SFPD is part of a large union. And so anytime there's a change in their working conditions, the city has to negotiate with the union, the police officers union, about those changes, how it impacts their jobs. Our city sometimes takes a very conservative view of that. Is there a role that other people can play in that? Not really, because it's kind of like the employer, the city and county of San Francisco, negotiating the terms of employment with the employees. So, but there's a lot of pressure that we can apply at the commission, asking where are the updates from this, DGO process? Why is it taking so long to meet and confer? This is an issue that we've had with the police commission in the city for a long time. Policies just go to the meet and confer process to die in a black hole, and nobody ever hears from them again. So I think that's really critical while the city's negotiating, for us to keep the momentum and keep the pressure up. So that's kind of the angle that we can be all involved with, but we're not directly involved with those negotiations with the Police Officers Association.
Great, thank you, Brian. And this also speaks to the group that is involved with the meet and confer process, the Police Officers Association. And the question is, the POA is notoriously against any changes to their process. How can this get past their resistance to any oversight of their work?
Yeah, I think it goes to kind of what I was answering the last time, is that, the part where we can really push back on is by applying maximum pressure to the commission. And when that policy comes back, if it's been watered down, everyone showing up and saying the commission can't accept this. This has got to go back. The city has to be more aggressive. I think what we've seen so far is that if we can apply pressure to the commission, political pressure, they can apply that political pressure to the city attorney, who can then potentially negotiate a better policy. The difficulty is, if there isn't that political pressure, then there's no urgency. That the commission doesn't have like the ammunition, for lack of a better word, to really fight and push back. But yeah, I think we can't get around the process entirely, but we can certainly mitigate whatever harm the POA tries to do to the policy during the meet and confer process.
Thank you, Brian. And just as a time check, we've got about 8 minutes left. We're going to try and squeeze in as many questions as we can. The next one I'll answer quickly. It is, can anyone attend the town halls, or is it limited to residents of those particular neighborhoods? And the answer to that is there are no restrictions. And when we get the calendar invite information, we will be sure to share it with folks who are registered on this Zoom this evening, and we will also share it with the rest of the community as well. It's absolutely important that we have good turnout, and the commission and the working group are 100% interested in hearing from everyone to make this as informed a policy as possible. The next question is, should the public only speak at town halls, or does it help to call into police commission meetings? And I'm going to go ahead and say, yes, you should absolutely call into police commission meetings. You should also speak at the town halls. And if you need help with talking points, we've got them put together, and we will be happy to distribute them at the appropriate time, and make sure that all of our social medias and our mailings that go out to folks include those and the best ways for you to participate and how. And then the next question is, the HR department negotiates with the SFPOA. Since Breed controls HR, can we apply pressure to her?
Yeah, I'll just briefly weigh in here. I think that we can, and we absolutely should. It's a challenging time right now in San Francisco, because it seems like the pendulum in the movement that momentum I think that we've all had for changing the system has kind of swung back the other way towards law and order and more policing. But I think that we have to then stand up and rise to that moment and push back on that. So absolutely, we can apply pressure to London Breed, because part of this is she appoints the people on the commission, right? And she directs them in the ways that they should go. And she has a very close relationship with the chief, right? And she also appoints the executive director of the Department of Police Accountability. So she's a very critical point here, that if we can apply pressure to her, that will definitely make this process much easier. That's a great question.
Thank you, Brian. And the next question is, it's good to know Chief Scott is supportive of this process. What role does SFPD play?
So their role is almost entirely like the coalition members who attend the working groups. This DGO, this policy revision process, is unlike previous policy revision processes in the sense that it's led by the commission. Other ones are led by SFPD, where they get to control what goes into it. The chief can reject or agree with the suggestions. This is just for the commission to then approve the policy. So basically, this is an end run around SFPD. And so yes, they've been publicly committed to this process, but the devil is really in the details. And from what we've interacted with the SFPD folks, they're not open to our version of this policy. And so they're going to play a role of opposition, not only in the working group meetings, but in the town halls. I'm sure they're going to stack the meetings with people who are fear-mongering and spouting facts and that don't even make any sense, are unconnected with actually what the policy proposal is, and are also going to be hostile to the policy when it goes in front of the commission. So they're going to have an oppositional role here, but I think that the commission is really in the driver's seat, and it's not our job as a coalition, but we really see ourselves as pushing the commission to be really aggressive in this space.
Thank you, Brian. And the next question is, and it's the last one I've got in the queue, it is, does the new district attorney get to play a role in the DGO 9.01 review process? Have they taken a position yet?
I can briefly answer this one. They have a seat at the table at the working group. The new DA does. She's appointed, I think, Anna Gonzalez to be part of the working group. They haven't taken a position formally. The previous DA had a policy to not prosecute cases resulting from pretextual stop. It's unclear whether the current DA has such a policy or will continue that policy at all. So there's not a clear answer on it. I highly suspect that they're going to be oppositional to this this policy and don't want to see it succeed. Or the alternative, what they're going to want is a policy so weak that they get credit for having something on the books, but it just doesn't do anything. I would suspect that it lands somewhere there. That's not to be antagonistic towards them. That's just indicative of the politics they've kind of articulated over the past couple of weeks.
Thank you, Brian. And one more question came in, and I think it's in response to the last one. It is, who else has a seat at the table in the working group?
Yeah, I can just quickly answer that one too. So in addition to the members of the coalition, different folks from SFPD, different representative groups, some affinity groups are there. Obviously the POA is there, but also a large contingent of community groups too were invited to this process. I think our coalition, we have 4 or 5 seats at the working table, but the commissioner who's leading this process has promised a very open and transparent process moving forward. And I think the first working group was that. It was a little raucous and it kind of got loud, but it was good. It was good for people to hear kind of the emotions and what people had to say. And I think the community played a really big role in that, just speaking up. So even though, lots of different folks are there, there's still a huge role for the community to play. And I think that, that's vital here.
Terrific. Thank you, Brian. And that will do it for our questions. I'm going to go ahead and get back to the last slide and put my information on the screen. And we're going to close. Again, thank you to all of our presenters. Thank you to the community who showed up and all of your thoughtful questions. We're looking forward to you playing a role in joining us in supporting this process. My name is Wesley Saver. Again, I am the Senior Policy Manager for the Glide Center for Social Justice. My email is on the screen. You can reach out to me directly if you have any questions. You can visit our campaign website, which is endbiasstopssf.org. And we will also, as follow-up, circulate the links so that you can join the campaign and learn the facts. Thank you so much. Everyone have a great evening.